now that we're talking about this land and my relationship to land, I realized that there are certain things I wanted to be a revolutionary when I grew up, and land was important, but not the ownership of land. And I realize now that I didn't want an attachment to anything that could be used to break my commitment to the struggle. And that meant owning land for me, because a mortgage and, you know, all of those things. And I watched people who began to compromise what they espoused as their values over being tethered to things. And I decided very early I would do without things, because I just didn't want that contradiction. I would make probably a very different argument with myself at this point in my life about how to do that. But I realized that for me, DC is home. I remember doing a story. I did housing organizing in DC for rent control. We had amazing successes because I deeply believed, and I went to Cuba. And when I went to Cuba, you cannot own anything other than your own house in Cuba, because housing is a right, not a privilege. And it's not something that you can profit from. So when I went, that was the way they talked about it. And I saw them, and I went with the Venceremos Brigade, so I was there for 7 weeks, and we did housing construction. So me, not knowing anything about construction, was putting up apartment buildings. And what was amazing to me is how they talked about space. That every apartment had to have a balcony so that you could sit outside and see your neighbors and see your children playing. And so there was a courtyard where they were playing, you know, they thought about people having a quality of life. It wasn't somewhere to stick people. And then I realized it didn't take these high-level skills to construct housing, so why couldn't we do things like sweat equity and help, you know? I still think about that. I still can envision even now how we take back land and empty buildings and construct something very different. It fundamentally shifted my thinking about land, about housing, about healthcare. I went to Cuba. The doctor lived in the apartment complex that we went to visit. And so she's showing us, talking about health, and a pregnant woman came in and she said, you know, I saw you smoking earlier today. And you know you're pregnant, right? You know what this effect is going to be. So she said, all of you saw her smoke too. If I saw her smoke, you saw her smoke. Why did no one do anything? I mean, so she even forgot that we were there as visitors. It was a whole engagement around space, place, responsibility to each other that was for me so amazing. So for me, it's been rough in DC. I did a story when I was a news reporter for WHUR called Chocolate City Melting Fast. This was 1978, 79. Because someone who worked at the the Metropolitan Board of Trade brought me a memo that talked about how they wanted to reduce the black population of DC to the national average, which would be about 12%. And the only way to do that was through the manipulation of housing prices and the price of land. And I thought, what? By the year 2000. And so based on the memorandum, I did this story, Chocolate City Melting Fast, because they had a plan about it. And they said the only way to do it was the manipulation of the housing and the cost of land, because everybody believes you only have a right to live where you can afford.
Ka, I really appreciate all that you've shared, I want to just
Mhm.
cue into one part where you were talking about your own organizing and successes you had, and then you said, because I really deeply believed, and you stopped there and talked about Cuba.
Mm.
Can you tell me what the end of that story was?
I really deeply believe that our whole model of development is so off. And it starts with because we think people have the right to own land and do whatever they want with it. And there's a part of me that's just furious about that. That people can move in and invade a space and just dispossess people and care nothing about what it means for them. When I read Root Shock, I really got in touch with what it meant to go home and there's no home anymore. And I wonder sometimes what this country would look like if Native Americans were still in charge of the land. Their model, their concept of development, we wouldn't have this level of density that make people not have real lives. I mean, I just deeply believe that what's wrong with humankind, that we could have such disparities of poverty, um, is because we fundamentally have individualized our relationship to everything and fundamentally to land itself. And we don't, the model that is accepted and been jammed down the throats of the world is one that says you get to do with to the land whatever you want if you own it, no matter the consequences. I worry about my grandchildren, what the world that they're inhabiting. Can it even sustain itself? That we could have a conversation about global warming as if it's a somebody made up concept of some leftist somewhere. It's so crazy. It's so fundamentally crazy to me. Some days I just sit and I think, I'm having a crazy conversation and it's making me feel crazy. So, yeah. So I struggle with wanting to own. Do I want to own a house? Do I would rather it be a co-op. I would rather live my value of that and not buy individually my little space. And so I think about that, deeply think about that. I drove by a school on Peachtree that's empty and thought I'd love to live there. I'd love to construct a community there with some people who really want to do something and make the world and leave the world better than we